Well, thanks so much, Catherine, for coming on today. We're really excited to have you on, and I know that you're, a bit of an expert, especially on the government and health side in the US. So we're very keen to hear more about that. And we've definitely had our own encounters with, like heavily regulated health content. Not so much on the government side here, but definitely with large enterprises, especially health-focused one, having a lot of medical regs, all of that stuff.
Well, great. Thanks for having me on. I'm happy to answer any questions that I can help you out with.
So what have you been working on most recently? I know you've got your agency that's keeping you busy as well.
Yeah. So I started my own business 7 years ago. So it's called WO Strategies. Mostly because I've only had entrepreneur type jobs. And so when I left Ketchum, which is what I was doing prior to this, so I built out and ran the online marketing and analytics team at Ketchum, supporting their clients globally. And when I left there, I had my first child, and everybody just wanted me to do build a brand new marketing team for this e-commerce, whatever kind of thing. And I was like, that is a lot of work. And yes, I can do it. I've built marketing teams multiple times over, but I actually think freelancing will be easier. And it turns out it was. It was also more fun because I get to pick the clients I work with. And I make as much as I did as a VP at Ketchum, but working part-time. So I can't complain. Yeah, so I've been very lucky. But by the time I went off on my own, I probably had, at this point, I have 18 years of SEO experience. So I've been doing this stuff for a long time. When I was at Ketchum, they actually hired me because I was moonlighting. I was employed somewhere else, but I was moonlighting because I'd met my boss, Tim. I was actually speaking at an American Marketing Association brown bag event, met Tim, loved him, really wanted to work with him. So he's at Ketchum. I actually interviewed a few times, but anyway, he's at Ketchum and he's like, "Hey, do you still want to do some moonlighting?" I'm like, "With you? Yes." And so he brought me on board, and he was the first digital hire that they had. So he was drowning and asked me to write the digital strategy portion of an RFP that helped them win the business promoting electronic health records for HHS here in the US. So I built the entire digital strategy for healthit.gov. And then we hired a team and we managed the website plus the social media handles and the paid and the analytics for 3 years for the federal government. So that was my first experience with the feds. And then since then, I've worked with National Cancer Institute, who experienced a bit of a traffic decline and brought me on board to try to figure out how to fix that. I helped them hire their first SEO internally. And then I've worked with the Fisheries Division of NOAA. So 3 different federal agencies.
That's definitely sounds really exciting and rewarding, but also quite challenging with all the Fed involvement. I am wondering, like from the first role, like from putting together the strategy from the RFP to then actually seeing that strategy get implemented and everything live. I think you mentioned like three years, but like, what did that process entail? How did it look like? I know that's probably a while back now. That first.
Yeah. Oh, honestly, it was easier because it's the development team at Ketchum that built the website. So I only had to convince my fellow team members and train them on SEO. And so we were involved, I set the rules. So we were involved with QA before the website launched. It was delightful. And then I helped build the architecture and review the content. And, so we were deeply involved in all of it. The challenge is that a lot of folks think that Google handles .govs in a special way, and they don't. You still have to build up an authority profile just like any other website. A lot of folks are shocked by that. But I've launched a new .gov, I will tell you. It's just like any other website. And so we had to do link building for the feds, which is very interesting. Especially at a PR firm. There are Gawker type websites out there that love to see PR folks mess up and do something unethical. So I was very aware of that. I was also very aware of the fact that all of our work is FOIA-able, right? So people can request we literally packaged up all our emails from 3 years and handed them to the feds. So, all of your communication could be, I don't know, part of a Wall Street Journal reporter thing if they wanted to. So because of that, we just did I don't know, it's the link building you would do today, right? With the exception of the fact that back then you could still do forum posting and directories, and that did something, which you wouldn't do today. Otherwise, most of it was like, let's find a person who has kidney cancer through the Kidney Association and do a profile on how electronic health records helped their kidney disease. And let's work with them and we'll pitch it all together kind of plan, which is very similar to what we do today for link building. I don't know if that answered your question, but honestly, it was pretty.
Definitely.
I think the challenging part, there were two challenging parts. One, some of the content was written by the feds. So I had to train their staff on how to write for SEO. That's always a little challenging, but there's not another way around it because they're the subject matter experts, especially when you wander over to National Cancer Institute. They've got a definite process for writing content, right? So I'm not going to write their content for them. Instead, I want them to tweak their content so it performs better. The other thing that was challenging is that we had a paid ad strategy because they had a bunch of target audiences, one of which was healthcare providers, so doctors. And Google had actually done some research back then about doctors and how they engage with Google search. And it turns out that a third of them click on paid ads, which is a really high percentage. So I knew that, put that in my strategy. I was like, we're going to have to run paid ads for these doctors because they don't really look at organic. They're going to click on the first paid ad. Right. And so it was part of the strategy, got approved, got budget approved and everything. It was part of the original plan. But at that point, I don't know who in the feds, except for maybe the CDC, was running any paid advertising. And then it doesn't really matter in the federal government here. It depends on which agency you're in and whether anybody in the agency has ever run paid ads, because it's kind of a new thing for the feds to put money down for online paid advertising. And so we did a dog and pony show. We did 15 different attempts to get them to turn on the paid ads, including having Google come to their offices, and we went to Google's offices and we did all sorts of things to just turn on that one element of the plan. But we eventually turned it on, and we actually ran YouTube ads for their sister organization, and that was very successful too. So
there's definitely a few questions that I want to touch on from there. Like the first one, like you mentioned, having to work really closely with the subject matter experts like cancer.gov. What was that process like? And, what did you find was the best way to really get everyone on the same page and align with like SEO friendly content, but also follow, the strict, like scientific, factual guidelines and everything else like that? Like that's something that we face a lot every day as well with large health enterprises.
I mean, I think the approach that ended up working was that these are very large organizations, right? So as an outside agency, it's pretty hard to move the ship without internal folks that are excited about SEO and are going to keep things moving. So when I first did the audit for National Cancer Institute, for instance, unbeknownst to me, they had 150 different subdomains on different CMS platforms run by different departments.
150.
Yeah. It turns out NOAA's worse. So when I looked at, mind you, fisheries is only one subdivision of larger NOAA. But when I looked at NOAA, they had 650 different subdomains, and some of them were subdomains, which I've never seen before. So anyway, so for National Cancer Institute, the conversation goes a bit like this. They're like, we hired you because we've lost traffic. We're not quite sure why. We would like you to help us figure that out. I'm like, well, one of your problems is your social media traffic drives about 14% of your traffic, and you have an external team of 6 and 2 people internally managing your social media. And your organic search is about 80% of your traffic, and nobody is managing your organic search program. Maybe to keep your traffic, you need to have somebody keeping an eye on it. Basically, like it's not rocket science.
It's how often, organic search is like the #1 acquisition channel.
You can't keep it without keeping an eye on it and working on it.
Exactly.
I mean, even as a Fed, like particularly as a Fed. So one of the things that I did with them was as a part of this larger other effort, they were doing like a competitive analysis. So they had me come and do the digital part. And instead of boiling the entire ocean, because they cover 260 different cancer types, we picked one or two to look at. So I did the deepest dive on breast cancer. And I, by the way, complicated because their website, I need to just look at the breast cancer part of share a voice in search. So I have a blog post about it if you ever need to do this kind of crazy thing that I did, because the tools out there won't let you do this. But say I just want to know of National Cancer Institute's breast cancer stuff. How much share of voice are they getting versus American Cancer Society, which also does multiple cancer types, and Breast Cancer Society, which just does breast cancer, and whatever the other nonprofit is that just does breast cancer, right? So stack all those up together. Who's got the biggest share of voice, you know? And it turns out that National Cancer Institute failed, I guess is the best way of saying it. They are completely outmaneuvered and outstaffed and out-resourced, and they're late to the game, which is basically what I told them. So they're up against Medical News Today, WebMD, Healthline, right? And some of those, like Healthline, has 9 SEOs on their team. Medical News Today has like 140 people that have got SEO in their title that you can find on LinkedIn. And WebMD has been doing SEO since before Google. And here's National Cancer Institute, 3 years ago, being like, I want to do SEO with no team, nobody doing any SEO. So I honestly was like, I think when it comes from a keyword targeting perspective, you should take it off your list, right? Because I can see how sophisticated, I mean, I gave them more details than that, but I can see how sophisticated they are. I would work on any of the other cancer types that are less competitive, right? Make sure they're mission-based, right? So they want to make sure if an American gets diagnosed with a cancer, they find accurate information in search to help that American citizen. So make sure that the rare ones that don't have great information are covered, that there's something appearing in search that's authoritative, and back away from the breast cancer that's well covered. Ditto with prostate cancer, ditto with a few of them actually. But anyway, that was the kind of assessment that I did with them. So for them, it's not creating new content, really. It's actually wrapping their arms around what they've got and making it work effectively. But there's a lot. You can't boil the ocean, right? So what parts are you going to work on? So one of the ones that I discovered in my audit, which actually led to a decent increase, is I was like, listen, why don't we tackle your clinical trials? Because it's a dynamically driven database search. It's very similar to something that I did when I was at Points of Light Foundation when I got my first start in SEO. So they really had just like a landing page for everything. Well, that's not how people search. Hopefully people don't have more than 2 types of cancers. Some people do, but hopefully most people just have the predominant one they're concerned about, right? So I don't want to land on a page that's about breast cancer if I've got liver cancer. I don't care. So what they didn't have was a clinical trials page for all the major cancer types. So we created dynamic driven pages, right? A low lift, doesn't involve a lot of experts, just to do that, and got them indexed. And they saw a 70% increase in keywords for clinical trials. So it's that kind of stuff that I wanted them to focus on first, because going back to the writers and getting them to, with the caveat being they had another technical issue that was hiding their content. So I worked on the 2 things that sort of hid their existing content first, and then worked on a content brief to kind of fix their existing content.
So it sounds like you kind of had to really nail down on, the less competitive and more, niche cancers that all the other nonprofits aren't talking about, and also really hone in on, what the feds can offer, with the clinical trials that maybe a nonprofit couldn't as well, and really leverage those types of information first.
It's also because I like to find something that will move the needle early on to show the client that you're actually driving results. Mind you, it took a long time actually. So I mean that the clinical trials thing I think took 9 months or so. It wasn't necessarily super fast, but like let's focus on something where there's less inertia to get it done, right? Like let's do that stuff first, even if it's more technical driven, because I knew the changing how they were going to write is like 6,000 trainings for the content people kind of thing. And then of course they brought in me, but then they also brought in, so the woman who wrote Letting Go of the Words, the book, which is a great book if you've never read it, she's based here in DC. And so she basically, her approach is like web writing, which is a piece of what I usually train on. They brought her in as an extra speaker too. So I kind of talk about like things need to have white space and bullets and the SEO piece that's obvious about, scannability, which Google cares about. And then Jeannie came in and talked about it from her perspective, which is the same stuff. Like I steal her stuff all the time. Anyway, so there was a lot of repetitive, let's try to get the writers okay with writing for search a bit and writing more for the searcher. However, I don't know, the one big finding that I found from the competitive analysis, and I don't know if they've been able to bake this in because this is a longer process, was I was trying to convince them to adopt. I have a version of looking at personas that's also based on like stage of the user. So it's like a user journey, but for also the persona, right? And it works out perfectly for them because as a cancer patient, you go through different phases and you have different emotions and you have different needs in different phases, right? But they think the emotions are a real big part for them. And I dug up the research about how being scared and angry impacts how you literally interact with stuff online, right? So you have less patience, you have less ability to sort through stuff. It's got to be much more clear and much more empathetic. So they got that. And then I showed them, interestingly, because American Cancer Society has a mid to senior level SEO that they stole from an agency, and they use the outside agency. So they're even more savvy than the feds were back when I looked at it. And you could see it in their meta description. This is before Google tinkered with them that much. But you can see they had the empathy in the meta description. It was kind of like, are you concerned about your breast cancer spreading? I mean, literally it was that kind of talking to the end user. And you can envision what the Fed's meta description was, right? So I think that's the last piece for them. I think that was part of why these other folks were outranking them, was actually taking into account the user's emotion in the copy that they're
with any health related content. Yeah, just super important to always be, like you said, empathetic, patient,
clear
as well. Yes.
Yeah, like not jargony, right? All that kind of stuff. And they had like some process in place for like not having the jargon in there. But I mean, I was the first one to talk to them about using the searcher's words in the copy, right? That was new to them. So obviously they were writing from a particular perspective with some research. They did user research for sure. It just wasn't online search driven user research.
That's something else that's always quite tricky, especially with, health content. There is a lot of medical jargon, and to be scientifically correct, there are like particular words and references that from a medical perspective, you do need to keep in there. So however you kind of manage that, but also keeping it like consumer driven, empathetic, based on what people would actually look for online.
The only example I can think of, but it's sort of relevant, is that so when electronic health records were launched, they really wanted to be clear about the fact that electronic health records are different than electronic medical records. And actually they are. So a medical record is like an individual medical record. The dream of electronic health records, which never really got fully executed, but the dream was that they're all connected and all of my doctors can see all of my records across everything. And we can run data on like everybody with diabetes, right? Because they're all connected, this bigger umbrella. So when we started, however, the software companies that sold the medical records were already out there marketing. So the volume was about electronic medical records. Nobody was searching electronic health records. Nobody knew what they were yet, right? So how am I going to educate people about electronic health records if nobody's actively searching for it? So it took me months, maybe even half a year, but I finally convinced them what they need to do is actually use the term and then educate. So we wrote a blog post, which ended up being their top driving blog post. I wrote it actually for years. But it was EMR versus EHR. What is the difference? Because people were searching EMR versus EHR. And so we actually wrote in the copy, electronic medical records are a part of an electronic, you have to use the term. But I mean, that took months of convincing the feds, because the feds were like, I don't want to use the term. I was like, well, you got to meet people where they are and then educate them. I don't know what to tell you. Search is it's a pull kind of thing. It's not a push. So anyway.
think that's great advice. Like at the end of the day, even if a client thinks that it's like potentially too basic, but if you put yourself in the minds of like the consumer, the reader who isn't sure, then that's what needs to be done.
Well, and I'll tell you though, it doesn't. So it works for some things, like you can convince the feds to do this, because I've been able to in certain instances. But pharma here, good
Mm.
luck, because the FDA has very clear regulations about how you can label certain things. So I worked on this drug that was for, oh, the last part is conjecture. I always forget the Dupuytren's conjecture, something like that. But basically, it's mostly white men of Nordic descent have these, like their hand starts becoming a claw like this. So everybody's looking for claw hand. That's the search volume. It's not the Dupuytren, the thing I can't even remember, right? It's the claw hand. But can I like do copy with claw hand? No. All those people searching with the generic version of the thing they have cannot find this drug information because the FDA won't let you.
So you wouldn't be allowed to say, put it in brackets and be like
Mm-mm,
colloquially known as forehead or something.
mm-mm. I tried. That was one of the few pharma clients I worked on. Because there were plenty others, because the pharma department in Ketchum was like, the offices were like right there, and they come around, they're like, I have this client, let's do on SEO work for them. I'm like, there's not much I can do. I maybe talk to the paid team. It was just like, I can't do much. But the feds are more flexible. And the fishery division was even more flexible. So they gave me a person who was a writing person. She was an expert on the fish stuff. She was actually from Fish and Wildlife, then moved over to fisheries. So she knew a lot about the feds and the fish, and trained her and somebody else on SEO and content writing and keyword strategy and all the rest. And what I love about working with the feds is most of them are really smart. They're really smart people. And so they love to learn, and they're passionate, usually not all of them, but a good number of them are passionate about the mission too. And so when you kind of explain the rules of the road,
That's great.
even though there's epic amounts of red tape, they really want to do the best they can, you know? So she was great, because I was like, hey, this page is not ranking because you're talking about the fish over here and everybody else searches for it over here, and we need to change the labeling. And she's like, okay, I'll have to go back to the subject matter experts, but we'll work on that. So sometimes it's easy. But I have a very heavy training approach for all of my clients, mostly because I also really like to train SEO people. I like to add more SEOs into the world. It's just my personal passion. So I pick clients on purpose that want to be trained, and pretty much all of them in my roster are folks that get trained. And my journal clients, I've trained on technical SEO because they're multi-million page websites with backlink profiles of anywhere from 30 million to 150 million backlinks. So the technical stuff is going to tank them. They need to know how to do the technical SEO part. So for them, I train them on the tech.
Yeah, especially for those publisher sites, it's going to be super important.
Yeah.
And like with the training, what would you say are like some of the key, like the main points that you think, it'd be super important to take your clients through?
Well, I mean, I customize the training based on the client, right? So, when it comes to the feds, with all of them, they had a development team, and they had me on board QAing tech tickets. So they got some training, but not a lot of tech training. Instead, the big moving the needle for them, because, in theory, I can get the tech stuff out of the way. And their websites were a bit smaller. So like 500,000, so not quite as big. And so instead it's about content. But for the academic journal sites, they're on a web platform where they need to fight with the web platform to prioritize their tickets. And that's really hard with a delay of me in between. So I had what I thought was going to be a standardized training, but then for one of my clients, I discovered a negative SEO attack. And so suddenly the link building piece became really bigger, because I know I don't normally cover that kind of negative SEO stuff. It's not their fault. Somebody was attacking them. But suddenly I had to bump up that entire section because that was important for them. They also had some malware that they didn't know about. So, I had to cover that too. But if I don't find malware, why would I train you on it? right? You're at a platform that's pretty secure. All of these were migrations too. So I knew they were moving to a better platform. So it's kind of like, I could cover it, but you probably won't need it. You know, you need it with the crappy one you left. And for one client, they were fine. And the other client, they just weren't. So that's why I trained them on it.
Something that I thought that you said was interesting earlier on as well was that, like with a .gov domain, that you still need to earn your authority, like as with any other site.
Mhm.
My question is like, as you start to build out the content on there, or you've added these new pages, like all the clinical trials and stuff, did you kind of see that authority, the traffic, the rankings kind of grow like much quicker than
You know,
hypothetically when
it's interesting because like it was a 3-year contract. So we were just done at year 3. That's just how these things work. And there wasn't addition. It's the way that project was going from a federal level, they pivoted their focus. So it's not like we would have gotten extra time. They moved on to doing something else. It wasn't about promotion and communication strategy. It was about interoperability, getting to that EHR piece. Anyway, so like there wouldn't be an extension. There was just no option for extension. But interestingly, because ran it while I was at Ketchum, but then they came back as a client with my current business. So I got to see how their rankings changed. So when we finished year 3, rankings were good, but we weren't owning all the top terms. But give it a couple more years and we were. So that's kind of interesting that a lot of it had to do with really building up a big, authority in Google's eyes. And it does take time. Maybe it would have taken more time if we, I don't know, had less red tape, maybe. But they got there eventually. But I only discovered it because that's a long story, but they redesigned without me on board. And they're like, hey, we lost traffic. How we lose traffic? And so suddenly I'm digging through like their rankings, right? Post the 3 years, but backwards from when they redesigned. And so only I care about this. But whatever point in time that was, I was like, well, look, we got all the rankings I was looking for. Because of course I've memorized the keywords because I worked on it for 3 years. Too bad they redesigned and they lost it. But they partially also redesigned because they're just not doing some of that stuff anymore. So those top rankings, they just don't want to rank for it anymore. Which, as an SEO makes me cry, but I have to move on. It's what they're doing for their business.
definitely feel that pain. Yes.
Yeah, exactly. They're like, oh, they were there. We worked so hard. And then they're not there anymore. Oh, well.
Something else on another note, I did want to ask you, like you mentioned when you were trying to target like medical professionals and how 30% of them would be coming in through paid. And
Mhm.
how would you differentiate like in your strategy between like, especially for medical, there will be the professional side, the healthcare professionals, and consumer facing as well. And they can be quite different in language and targeting and
Mhm.
all of that.
I convinced them to run focus groups. That's what we did. We actually did focus groups with healthcare providers, and we did 2 levels of that. So we did the healthcare provider, the doctor, but then we realized perhaps the doctor's too busy, which is true, to do this electronic health record thing. So who is the person underneath, the admin-ish person who's actually going to be doing the Googling? So that was interesting too, was to figure out what level of information needs to be available for the person that's getting assigned setting up a new AHR, because it's like picking software. Of course your like office manager is going to get assigned that or whatever. And then the healthcare provider. But what we ended up doing on the website was actually having 3 clear columns because they also wanted to talk to policymakers. And it's just radically different stuff. So, and mind you, the websites can radically shift now because now they've got this developer audience. But we had a big consumer chunk, and we had we'd literally put labels at the top, the different chunk for doctor stuff, because the doctors had to meet, it's like a carrot and a stick thing. And they have to meet different regulations. And then at certain spots, they would get kicked over to Center for Medicaid Services. Because if they didn't move by a certain amount of time, they couldn't take Medicare money, et cetera, et cetera. So like there's all this regulations involved. And then there was the policymaker kind of chunk of content. But focus groups. I can give them research from Google, but we had the budget. That was part of the plan. And we were really good friends with the research division at Ketchum. And we ended up eventually, digital and research ran the entire thing at some point, which is a whole other gossipy story. But yeah, the client decided that the social marketing people they didn't want those folks running the account. Instead, they put digital and research at front. Which is fascinating. So yeah.
Yeah, I think it'd be great to be able to do focus groups to really all the time if we could, to really understand, like just doing research, user research in person, or I guess surveys if we needed to really understand the difference.
What you need to sell through, and I forget what the name is though, because I just found one that was cheaper. While I was at Ketchum, I had this offshoot thing with Hertz. So Hertz was launching a Zipcar competitor, and they were launching it in New York and DC. And I wanted to convince them that they needed to I wanted to put in front of them what people were searching for as part of their search campaign. And as a side note, I also had this user testing account, and I had a little bit of new business wiggle room with that account. And so I was able to recruit the demographic in New York and DC, and everybody's on their phones and they're talking out loud like user testing does. And it was delightfully amazing information. So we gave them a scenario. We had them talk out loud about what keyword they were going to use. They then put the keyword in, and then they clicked on whatever thing they wanted to click on, and they walked through why they clicked on it. And then I made them go back and click on something in particular and talk about that. Anyway, I highly recommend that everybody starts with this scenario. I'm going to articulate out loud what keyword I'm going to use from search thing, if you can do it. Because there was a guy in New York who used the word car service. And I was like, I would have never used the word car service. Anyway, the keywords were just like, whoa. And then the personalization from Google was astonishing. And so I still have it on my YouTube channel. You can at least see the personalization. Because this one person in DC had no car anything, and they got WMATA, which is like the local metro, and like Washingtonian, and like her search was radically different than anybody else. Anyway, so part of it was also just talking. I presented on it at one of the shows, I forget which one, but the idea was, search is more personalized than you think, and that frankly everybody should try to rally for this kind of budget, because we're using a tool, but we don't actually know if our target audience is using those keywords.
That's a great point. It's like that way you can actually really validate with your exact target group, pretty much.
Yeah. The other outstanding insight is that they all, like most of the results, except for the DC one where they had the metro, all of them had kind of a crappy aggregator kind of website, looked like circa Craigslist kind of vibe. And when I saw it, I was like, nobody's going to click on that because it looks like crap. Everybody clicked on it. Everybody. And I was like, okay, duly noted. Like that means that it's like Barnacle SEO, right? You need to get listed there, because clearly for whatever reason, everybody's clicking on that one. And it didn't matter where it was in rankings necessarily. Everybody was like, oh, look at this one. Like, oh, okay. I wouldn't have. But again, I was not the target audience, right? I had a car. I'm in DC. I'm different, Anyway, for what it's worth, that's my big rally cry. If you can get budget for user testing and do search user testing, I think it's really insightful.
And is your recommended tool, is that like the usertesting.com?
Well, yeah, the thing is usertesting.com is crazy expensive. And I think my last newsletter, I found the one that was cheaper. It's either the last newsletter or the one I'm currently writing. I found one that's much more affordable, finally. I've been on a little bit of a bent to like finally discover something that's not user testing, but is user testing like. Anyway, so I finally found one, but I don't remember the name.
Yeah.
I'll have to send you the link to it. I forget what the name was.
And like with that, what kind of like sample size have you seen kind of work the best?
We only did, I always look up Jacob Nielsen for like the numbers of that kind of stuff. But I want to say we did like 6 to 8 in each city, which I believe is statistically significant when you come to user testing. Anyway, so not a huge number.
It's definitely something worth looking into. If we have the budget, or this potentially if it's cheaper, I think it'd be great. Yeah.
Or if all else fails and the client lets you try it again, right? Or something, you got that magic moment where you're like, you know what? We've never really gotten smart about our target audience. Maybe we should do that to make our campaigns more successful,
Yeah, it's something they would love. Yeah.
Yeah. Also, it's really much easier to persuade the client with video feedback, or data in general. I mean, I had a client come to me once where they were a site focused on female entrepreneurs, actually, which is funny because I'm a female entrepreneur. But I did not know what their site was about or who they were. It was very confusing. And so I did the 8-second test, which I believe is still free, though Twitter's failing. So I don't know if what other platform you can do it on. I did it on Twitter, and it like gives you this really quick link. It's an 8-second test, right? So you send it to your friends. No, never mind. I think I did it on Facebook. So I sent it on Facebook and I said, anybody got some free time? It only takes 8 seconds. Give me some feedback. So you can do like 10 people or something. And the feedback was, I have no idea what this website is. Who are they? What do I do? I don't even know. I'm so confused. And I sent that to the client. I said, I was confused, but I wanted to confirm I wasn't the only one. And it turns out that this tiny little pool, this is not your target audience, mind you, they're just random people. But out of this random set of people, they are also confused. So before we do SEO, I believe you should meet with my friend John, who runs a UX firm, and he should help you figure out who you are and who you're talking to. And that's what they did first. It was much more successful.
You got to get your, the branding and all that sorted first before users can really understand and then really relate to any of the SEO that you're going to do.
Exactly. And, and then it helps when you're doing keyword research because you can actually like target who you're actually talking to. You can be clear about it versus they were a bit all over the place.
So this 8-second test, is that like pretty much like you ask someone to go over to their website or to their socials and just, be like, what was this page about? Who are they? Kind of thing?
Yeah. So it's a traditional test in UX. So like, say I put everybody in a room and the 8-second test is I give you like a screenshot of the website and I only let you look at it for 8 seconds and then I take it away. And you're supposed to answer who owns the website? What can I do on the website? And I forget what the third question is. There's a third question. But anyway, this is an online version of that. And I forget, I'll have to send you the URL. I can dig it up. But yeah, it's like a little free tool where you can crowdsource with a few of your friends and do the same thing.
Something else.
I'm sure they have a paid option too, by the way. It's just, you can at least try the little free.
See what we can do. Yeah.
Yeah.
I was going to say as well, something you touched on earlier was building out, like personas mapped to the customer journey and also tied in with like people's emotions at different stages. And have you tried to kind of break that down? Like, at this stage, they might be feeling this way, but someone else could be feeling like this, like.
I mean, I used it with National Cancer Institute, so I don't know that there is necessarily a big difference. So like newly diagnosed have a set of emotions. There is more than one, but it's all the same for everybody. There's not that much variability. But the bigger thing from them was connecting the emotion, but also being clear about what the action is you want them to take, because the feds don't quite do that. I mean, so the feds I've worked with, they have personas like pretty picture and it's Jane and she's got a demographic of whatever and she likes shoes. It's like that kind of persona, which believe me, I've seen plenty of those. Even big brands that I've worked with at Ketchum have that level of persona. I just don't think it's actionable. So if you break it down into a journey, you're like, okay, Jane, who's the mom of 35 with the 2 kids, she also got diagnosed with cancer and she's going to go through the stages where she can interact with your organization. And she has emotions at different stages. And you can see that sometimes in her keywords. You put the keywords on that stage, and you're like, based on the keywords and the emotions and how I think we could help her in the organization, we need to create X content, or we have X content, but we need to adjust it so that it addresses the emotions and the questions, the burning questions she's got. Right. So I was doing keywords. We probably now doing more like topic-based stuff, but and even because the feds really didn't think of that, because I'm like, you still have an advocacy actually on the end. You want people to be like, National Cancer Institute information was great. You actually want that last piece. And they hadn't really thought of all of that, and then there is usually a comparison. I mean, it's not quite like an e-commerce match, but e-commerce people do this all the time. But folks that don't, I like to work with big folks that don't have an e-commerce focus, but I think it's relevant for them to still do a user journey.
And in terms of like, say, from a consumer perspective, like you'll have like the patient or the sufferer, and then you might also have like secondary audiences, like the carer, or it's like the loved one. How have you tried to like kind of make sure we're kind of speaking to both and kind of differentiating with that kind of content?
That's a really good question. I forget how National Cancer Institute actually worked with some of that. I think particularly they talked about it in one of the stages. I want to say it was some of the latter stages for everybody with cancer. Unfortunately, you're not really the one doing the Googling anymore, right? So I think that was how it kind of played out, that when you were, because for them, there was a palliative care, I'm not going to recover stage, unfortunately, right? Because not everybody has their cancer cured and has a rosy outcome. So, we talked about there was that one stage where there's too sick, they're not even the one searching anymore. So yeah, we did talk about it, but I think it was more related to what they know about people suffering with cancer.
Makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think I've asked a lot of questions. So now's probably a good time. I'll open up the floor if anyone else from the team who's on the call has any questions.
Spent a lot of time talking about feds, but not journals too. So if you got any journal questions, throw them my way.
We throw that in after too. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mine's more just about like client client management and trying to figure out, I guess, like the most diplomatic way to deal with like content teams and regulations and stuff like that. What is like your strategy in terms of like providing like a clear and like friendly path of communication from like an SEO perspective when dealing with content teams?
So, I mean, a couple of things. The only ones that are all right, well, my 3 different vet experiences, I looked out because I was being brought in by somebody very senior. So there was somebody at a high level who cared. So we should kind of start there, because you might get a client where you just don't have the senior buy-in, at which point you're sunk. So with fisheries, it was the CTO who actually was really interested in increasing their exposure. For National Cancer Institute, when John McCain got diagnosed with his form of brain cancer, National Cancer Institute was not found in Google search, and the senators got ticked. And there you go. Now I'm helping them, right? So anyway, there's some higher level force. So that part of it's that. But then the other piece was a mix of training, having an internal person who's coordinating and rallying, doing all the things that I did when I built internal teams, which is a lot of continuing to do brown bags and finding your cheerleaders and all that kind of stuff, reporting, figuring out how you're going to nudge people who didn't have any metrics tied to their writing to have metrics tied to their writing. And are you going to just, in fact, I remember deeply the conversation with fisheries about this. Like, are you just going to come up with something where everybody gets celebrated who has gotten better traffic? Or is there going to be some kind of professional development performance negative thing if their content tanks? Like actually starting them to think about that. Like, how are you going to tie the performance of their content to something related to their job performance? Because if you don't, like, they're going to stop caring at some point. So a big part of it is like culture stuff.
Yeah.
A big part of it. So I try to make sure, and putting the reporting in place, which is easier said than done, depending on how big your website is and what you're doing. And then also just making sure they're focusing in the right place. Like I talked about, like when I started with National Cancer Institute, the first chunk, I was busy doing technical, the in-person was setting the keywords, et cetera, et cetera. They set the keywords like, we're going to rank #1 for breast cancer and the liver cancer and the prostate cancer. And then I do this competitive, because she didn't do any competitive analysis. And also she was a bit junior at that point. Then they bring me in to do the competitive analysis. And I'm like, whoa, actually take all those high volume keywords off your list. That's why you haven't been successful. Instead, let's do something different, which obviously changes your rating plan. And then you got to figure out, for all of these, they don't have manpower. So I convinced fisheries to do 2 part-time internal people, and National Cancer Institute was 1 full-time, but 150, right? So the volume's crazy. So how do they do content briefs? How do they handle the reporting? How do they not drown in the reporting and keep doing strategic stuff? How do you convince them to buy their first set of software? Because they didn't have any software. And obviously they are a type of organization that at some point could be like a Bright Edge type place, but they've never paid that kind of money for an SEO tool. So I'm not going to sell that in. So instead we're like, how can we make SEMrush work when it's not going to actually count everything because you're too big. Right? So there's that kind of unique thing. So with the journals, they're so big, they would have to do like the Moz product where you can buy keywords at 5 cents a piece, but then they'd have to really know they care about the keywords. And they're
Yeah.
not there yet because most of their stuff is written by people who submit papers. So, so instead we use BigQuery, import all their information out of Google Search Console because they're huge, and create custom reporting in Google Data Studio, and a little bit of SEMrush manual data pull across the entire website. Like you get really creative about some of that. But anyway, you can't like move the writing needle and persuade people unless you also nail down the reporting. And oftentimes that's challenging. Did that answer your question?
Yeah. That's, I guess, like accountability seems to be like the biggest kind of takeaway from it. But
why would you care? Like, just envision you were employed there. Like, why would you care if it's never going to impact your promotion?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, interesting.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for
And
talking
well,
today.
and then you're up against the thing I told them is like you're up against the Healthline. Like for National Cancer Institute, you're up against Healthline, which is an e-commerce search first business. It's absolutely built off of search. And so I'm sure they've baked some of that into personal job descriptions. So mind you, the feds aren't going to fully adopt that because they're feds.
Yeah.
But you at least start brainstorming with them about like, okay, can we do I don't know, an extra gift card or a lunch? Something, right? Something.
Yeah. No, it's good insight. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
And that's a tricky one because a lot of the time in large organizations, there isn't always someone who's going to be responsible to be like, it is our job to focus on it, the SEO channel, and get all this amazing content out. And they are maybe focusing on other easier wins, whether that's like, with paid or from a product or design perspective more so. But ultimately, like you said, it is about having that buy-in.
Or at the very least, put it in their job description. If you've got like a UX person that now has to do some stuff for the SEO team, maybe their job description needs to be updated. Right? Like that kind of blocking and tackling at the very least. But if you don't bring it up as a consultant, they're never going to think about it. That's the other big piece. They're just going to assume that the UX guy is going to help you freely, perpetually. It's just not how life works. I'm sorry, it's just not.
It then definitely becomes more of an organizational change thing, if we're changing the scope of that, expectations of other teams as well. Yeah.
Well, and then just imagine their challenge being in that, okay, these 150, we're talking about 150 subdomains, right? At National Cancer Institute, most of them not ranking. Also managed by somebody who's not even doing it full time. It's like they volunteered and they're doing it a few hours a month. Totally not updated at most of them. So they're not ranking, they're not updated. And here's the part that's heartbreaking. It's good stuff. It's like good content. Like our taxpayer dollars are freaking paying for it. It's good stuff. And what they need to do is not post it on their own in their tiny little subdomain that doesn't have the authority with Google. They need to come up with a policy to get it onto the main domain that's ranking in Google, right? So communicating that to all these folks who really love their little tiny thing, but they didn't even have reporting in place. So step one, let's get the reporting in place and prove to them that all their work and effort is just not paying off. And it's worthwhile stuff that should be found, right? So, I mean, you can hear that's my other passion for all of these people. They've got worthwhile stuff that should be found, but they just don't know how to get it well presented into Google, or a developer has done something to F it up. And that's why it's not in Google. That also makes me mad. Well,
I mean, something like trying to get off the subdomain and moving that into the main one, that would obviously be like such a huge challenge, big change.
It's also a security problem because they didn't have any policy for like malware for all the subdomains. Right? Just think about like
incremental steps that help to persuade that, that now it is time to move on to the main domain, or
no, it was definitely we can't have them all riot against us. Let's figure out how to soft pedal this with multiple internal things.
Yeah.
Training, whatever. I mean, we're talking the most epic amount of red tape, but that's how it needed to happen in order to eventually move them. I mean, it's a perpetual problem. I don't even know if they've shut down most of these 150 yet. And we're talking years later, you know. But just in general, it makes, this is, I posted once with a question. I want to say it was like one of the big Slack groups. Anyway, I was looking for help and I mentioned I was working on federal websites and some dude was like, that's a waste of our taxpayer dollars. They don't need SEOs. I was like, dude, they do. In fact, they do. They all need an SEO.
Perceptions. Yeah.
Our taxpayer dollars are getting wasted because there's no SEO involved. Like they need help. Anyway, side note, I was really mad. I was like, also, I don't know how many SEOs have been around with the beginning of like a little baby.gov. I was there with a little baby.gov. I can tell you definitively, they have to build up authority. There's no magic dust that's and believe me, I asked the Google staff too, because the client wanted to know. But like, there's no magic dust that you like immediately start ranking. We were in the sandbox for 6 months, just like every other website. Well, yeah, think about that. We launched a brand new .gov and we basically got no traffic for the first 6 months.
Yeah, it just really proves that just need to do the hard work and
yeah,
there's no shortcut.
It's not
unfortunately.
Unfortunately, there's not. Yeah.
I'm wary of time as well. So if anyone else has any questions, can probably take like one more.
I think my only other little tidbit, and then I'll stop talking, is that I think there's maybe only 3 of us that know anything about Google Scholar in the search space. If you're listening to this and you know anything about Google Scholar and you're an SEO, please talk to me. But I found 3 of us. And so it's different. And I have a blog post on my website that talks about the difference between Google Scholar's crawling and Googlebot from a technical perspective, because I got a lot of pushback with some of these platforms about what we needed to do for big Google search versus Google Scholar. It's hard information to find. So anyway, if you ever work on like fisheries had its own journal. So if you ever work on a federal website that also has an academic journal, there's like this extra steps to do to make sure they're found in Google search and not also make sure they're like, you don't want to lose their ranking in Google Scholar. They're being found in Google Scholar. So for what it's worth.
Fascinating. Like, yeah, we've never really had to do with Google Scholar for the SEO side of things as much.
Yeah, my bigger challenge has been they're on a platform that's a Google Scholar partner. So they follow all the rules for Google Scholar. Sometimes you need to do something different for Google search, and trying to convince them of that has been challenging. So that's where the post would be helpful for other folks.
I mean, what have you seen is like one of like the main differences, like to try to rank in Google Scholar?
Well, so there's very little public information out there about Google Scholar from a technical perspective. And the little bit that's there, which is dated, basically says, go look at the Google Webmaster Guidelines. So the Search Console guide, right? And you can't talk to a Google Scholar rep as an SEO. However, my client could talk to a Google Scholar rep. And so I prepped her with some questions. That's where the blog post comes in. But really, the big takeaway is that Google Scholar, if you're on a partner platform, there's like 12 of them or something. Google Scholar knows the format of these websites, which helps them understand and find information. But Google Scholar crawls with Googlebot. That's the part I'm still fighting with some of these developers. So if I see errors in Google Search Console for Googlebot, there's a good chance that Google Scholar might be seeing the errors too, because it's the same crawler, right? So maybe you shouldn't blow me off when I try to fix the Google bot errors in Google Search Console. But the other big challenge is just these all of them, because now I've talked to 3. They all focus on the Scholar, which is great. But it's such a tiny percent of traffic. For all of my clients, 80% is Google search. So they don't want to stop doing Scholar, but they don't want to do something for Scholar, and it means that they don't get the Google search traffic.
Because it'd be probably mostly, I guess, professionals and potentially like students who'd be using Scholar, I assume.
Yes. Though it's interesting because one of my former clients, most of their target audience is cardiologists. let's go back to the doctor thing where they all click on
Yeah.
Google ads, right? So those cardiologists are not using Scholar. They're definitely using Google search. So yeah, they're sort of in Scholar for a few of the researchers, but most of the stuff that they're publishing is directly for a cardiologist to read and use. So search is big for them. And then National Academy of Sciences, who I work with, they have a wide variety of content, and some of it's COVID research, some of it's sociology type research, some of it's just publicly available for you and I, if we wanted to actually read it, is what I'm trying to say. So it depends on the journal. Not all of it's wonky. Some of it is. One of my clients is a little wonky, but not all of it.
Well, it sounds like you've got regular, like a newsletter. If people want to, get in touch after this or take a look at some of your blog posts, what are the best ways to get that?
Sure. Yeah. So probably my website is wostrategies.com. And from there, you can get to both my podcasts, plural. I have a daily SEO tips, which is also an Alexa flash briefing that I haven't had a chance to do much with this year, but I hope to revive. And then the Digital Marketing Victories podcast, of which I'm a host, where we talk about the soft skills involved in selling through your digital strategies. So particularly this persuasion thing, like how do you convince the feds to do X, Y, and Z? That. So yeah, so check those out. You can sign up for my newsletter. It's barely monthly, so I will not pummel your inbox. I write it frankly for my clients, for them to have the most recent up-to-date news, but you should definitely sign up if you find it useful. Also on Twitter, but hopefully Twitter will stay alive. That's KWATIER, and I'm also on LinkedIn.
Sounds great. We'll definitely check it out. And yeah, thanks again for your time today. Really appreciate you coming on. And yeah, if you're ever down in Australia, in Sydney, we're running SEO events, SEO meetups. Be great to see you there. Or if we're ever in New York.
You're right. Yeah, my husband and I honeymooned in Australia, so we would love to
yeah?
go back and bring the kids. It would be a blast. Yeah, we love Sydney.
So we're probably planning to run a SEO, a bigger conference next year. Now that COVID's kind of calmed down. Yeah.
Cool. That's awesome. Yeah. Thanks for having me. And it would be great to meet up in person at some point.
Well, thanks so much, Katherine.
Thanks, Katherine.
Yeah, you're welcome.